Kindly invite sir to
Yes,
begin the session.
yes. A very good morning to all of you. Okay, so here I would grab the opportunity to introduce Dr. Avishek Parui. I'm honored to have Dr. Parui as a keynote speaker. Dr. Parui is a PhD from Durham University. He is assistant professor in English at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. His research interests include modernism, memory studies, and masculinity studies. His work has appeared in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism, Catherine Mansfield Studies, Literature and Medicine, Economic and Political Weekly, and South Asian Review, among other places. He is the winner of Meenakshi Mukherjee Prize 2019 for the Best Published Paper, conferred by the Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies. He's the author of Postmodern Literatures, Orient Black Swan, New Delhi, and is currently contracted with Roman and Littleton for a book entitled Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, and Memory. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Avishek Parui. Let us welcome Dr. Parui with a round of virtual applause. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Borah. Thank you, Manali, for this very kind invitation. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
sir,
sir,
you
you
are.
are.
Yeah, okay, excellent. It's a great opportunity for me to interact with such a fine audience. And I congratulate the organizers of this conference for conceiving such a well-timed conference. I think it's something which we need to urgently look at in terms of the situation we are all experiencing today. The title of my talk today is the ontology of the pandemic. So, what I'll do in this particular session is I will sort of try to map some familiar critical theory readings in terms of understanding this COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of how we experience it, how it is a cultural phenomenon, and how it's an experiential phenomenon. And obviously, I'll talk about the public space and private space and how those differences are getting blurred with the emergence of this particular pandemic. Now, at the very outset, just a couple of lines about the title of my talk, the ontology of the pandemic. So, as some of you would know, I have drawn on the Captain Malaby book, The Ontology of Accident. Right. So, the whole idea of the accident, how does she look at accident from a theoretical, critical study, critical theory lens? Right. So, what perspective can critical theory offer in terms of our understanding of the accident? Now, obviously, the way Malibu looks at accident and the way Alan Baidu looks at the event can be equated, can be compared, the comparable categories. So, in Malibu's reading, the accident is something which changes the existential ontological order permanently. In other words, an accident is an ontological interruption. I'll say that again. An accident is an ontological interruption, in the sense that nothing which emerges out of the accident, a post accident, can be comparable to what was before. And obviously, Malibu draws on medical humanities, Malibu draws on trauma studies, Malibu draws on philosophy. She draws on a series of philosophers and neuroscientists such as Spinoza, Antonio Damasio, to corroborate her point. So, what I'll do in this particular session is I will draw on Malibu's reading of the accident in terms of how we can map that onto our understanding of COVID-19, the phenomenon that we all experience here collectively. Because in some sense, it's a collective accident. It's something which we're all experiencing together. So the very ontology of the accident, which is often private in quality, something which happens to one person or to a particular group, which marks it as a different kind of event, and that has obviously been undercut because the accident of COVID-19 is a collective accident. So in that sense, it complicates the ontology of the accident. But in the other sense, it is also corroborating what Malibu talks about as an interruption of an ontological order. Because the COVID-19 has obviously interrupted and defamiliarized our understanding of reality, the way we consume reality, the way we consume knowledge, the way we consume familiarity, they all have been interrupted permanently in this COVID situation. And obviously, we are not yet in a post COVID situation, far from it. We are very much in the middle of it. But we can still see, we can clearly see how our understanding of reality, our understanding of social reality, our understanding of discourse might change permanently post COVID. And already, this particular conference is a very good case in point in terms of how the methodology and the consumption of knowledge will change. Because this is the way forward, perhaps, in the foreseeable future in terms of how conferences, seminars will be organized and attended. In other words, our consumption of knowledge systems will change, perhaps has already changed with the arrival of COVID-19. So I look at the word accident from a critical theory lens, something which metamorphoses reality as we know it, something which is a permanent defamiliarization of reality, and something obviously which doesn't have a shape. That's a very important point of the accident, or what Malibu calls disruptive plasticity in her work. If you read the ontology of the accident, she talks about constructive plasticity and disruptive plasticity. Just to very quickly summarize the difference, constructive plasticity is an order in which destruction and construction happen simultaneously. So, when Malibu talks about, for example, cellular suicide, how cells kill themselves just so new cells can be born. For example, when a baby is born, the very formation of the fingers of the baby requires cellular suicide. So the cells between the fingers must kill themselves in order for the fingers to form. The gap between the fingers must occur due to cellular suicide. So that's a very good example of constructive plasticity. So a plasticity with that destruction and construction happening simultaneously. But obviously, what Malibu talks about is pure plasticity, a pure destructive plasticity, in which there's no constructive quality at all. So there's just a destruction of an older self, a destruction of an older order, an older ontological order. And obviously, if you look at fiction, one of the finest examples that we can find in modern fiction is Kafka's Metamorphosis, which is a text that Malibu talks about quite extensively, how it has a permanent ontological interruption, a permanent ontological arrival. It's like a shapeless thing, right? So the other theorist that I will mention in passing during the session is Deleuze. And again, Deleuze is mentioned by Malibu. So Deleuze's reading of Kafka's Metamorphosis is mentioned by Malibu in her book, The Ontology of the Accident, which is the title that I'm drawing on when I'm talking about the ontology of the pandemic. But again, the whole idea of Deleuze is critical of Kafka because Deleuze is saying it's a deterritorialization which also becomes another shape. Now, this is important because we are now in a very Deleuzean territory. And if you read Deleuze's work, such as Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Thousand Platos, the very space of Plato is important. A Plato is a space between two hills, right? So it has an interstitial quality. It has a sort of borderline twilight quality about it. It's a space where it's between two landmasses. So in that sense, it's not really a landmass. It connects to landmass, but at the same time, it also bridges and differentiates between two landmasses. So I draw on Deleuze's idea of deterritorialization as a connective category to Catherine Malibu's understanding of the accident. Now, the only difference between these two theorists are what Deleuze argues in his reading of schizophrenia and capitalism is that any form of deterritorialization will eventually arrive at a re-territorialization. So there'll be a re-territorialization. So after the deterritorialization takes place, after the defamiliarization takes place, it will be a remapping till the point that we have a new order, a new shape, a new ontology. Now, in the case of COVID-19, I think if you use a Deleuzean framework to look at COVID-19, it becomes complicated because what we're experiencing today is a sort of a permanent deterritorialization, a permanent demapping, a permanent defamiliarization, with no possibility, at least from this point, no possibility of looking at or anticipating a re-territorialization. So there's no remapping happening at the moment. It's only demapping. So our understanding of reality, our understanding of space and time, our understanding of knowledge, our understanding of social relationships, they all are being permanently defamiliarized. And that's obviously a very solid and robust critical theory perspective that one can take in terms of looking at the entire ontology of the pandemic. But let me just repeat what I said at the very beginning, that one basic fundamental difference between this pandemic and the way accident is understood by the news and and Malibu is that this particular pandemic has a very perverse democratic quality about it. And I was in a session a couple of days before where we talked about how this pandemic, in a very perverse way, has leveled away all kinds of differences that we normally assign into people: difference in class, difference in education, difference in money, of course, difference in privilege. So it has sort of reordered our understanding of privilege. It has re-territorialized our understanding of privilege. So we don't quite know at this point of time who is more privileged in this pandemic and who is less privileged, because we have celebrity people, celebrity actors, writers, politicians who are being infected by this pandemic. So no amount of protection as we know it, no amount of privilege as we know it, and it can offer you a sure shot immunity against this infection. So the way this infection is operating is quite perversely democratic. And obviously I use the word democratic in a very extreme sense. There's a randomness principle at work over here. There's a randomness in which this infection is operated, the way it is spreading. And one of my research interests is the study of contagion. How does contagion spread? And obviously, I use contagion as a conceptual category rather than just as a medical category. Because if you look at COVID-19, it's a very fine example of complex contagion. What I use the term complex contagion. Now, what do you mean by complex contagion? The complex contagion, it has a corporeal quality. It affects bodies, it infects bodies. It has an intercorporeal quality, like it's something that spreads across bodies. So one body can infect another body, and vice versa. So there's a very medical, corporeal, embodied quality about contagion in this particular sense. But also, equally, there's also an information contagion, an information infection that we see happening around COVID-19, because we have a series of it's like a wildfire of information. All you have to do is switch on your smartphone or your TV or your laptop, and you're bombarded with an explosion of information. Half of it is uncertain, half of it, more than half of it, is uncertain and random and unempirical, but still it is being consumed continuously. So we have a fine example of information contagion and corporeal contagion, and hence my term complex contagion. So I think this COVID-19 is a very fine example of a kind of contagion, a kind of complex contagion, which infects us at the level of knowledge, at the level of the episteme, hence the idea of knowledge, I mean the way we consume knowledge, our understanding of knowledge, and of course at a very real corporeal level of the body. So the body gets infected, the knowledge system gets infected, and obviously this infection spreads in a way which is quite, again, perversely speaking, democratic in quality. No one has the answer. No one has any idea in terms of understanding the ontology of this pandemic. So there's a bit of an irony in the title of my talk today. So when I'm saying the ontology of the pandemic, what I'm actually saying is we haven't really arrived at the ontology. This pandemic does not have an ontology. So it's just purely destructive plasticity, in the way Malibu studies it. There's no re-territorialization. It's just a permanent order of de-territorialization, a permanent order of panic, a permanent order of ontology-lessness, shall we say. So this is my idea of complex contagion. In a way, this particular pandemic is operative. It is spreading. So there's a sort of a spreading quality about it. It's distributive in quality. It is not top down. It is not bottom up. It doesn't, it doesn't really pay any attention to class. It doesn't really pay any attention to privilege. So it is purely distributive in quality. It is purely random in quality. And it infects us at the level of knowledge, it infects us at the level of bodies, it infects us medically, intellectually, and also epistemically. And that's a very key term, the epistemic quality of this pandemic. So how it is spreading at the level of knowledge. So how we as citizens are getting sort of information infection on a daily basis. So we have, for example, the optimism, the euphoria around a particular drug which might come out, and the very next day the euphoria is shot down. It's something which is sort of de-empiricized. It's sort of say that it's not scientifically proven, etc. So the whole idea of an address to this pandemic through a drug, through a medicine, through any tangible quality, that is unavailable at the moment. And this unavailability of a tangible response, whether through a medicine, whether through a narrative, is what makes this particular contagion so complex in quality. That we're constantly consuming this contagion at a bodily level, at an intercorporeal level, and also at an interepistemic level. different knowledge systems are clashing with each other. Different knowledge systems, the medical system, the cultural system, the political system, everything are sort of clashing with each other in terms of how this contagion is spreading. So we have different kinds of political orders constantly in conflict with each other, different kind of medical orders, so different medical schools coming together and conflicting with each other. So in other words, the whole idea of complex contagion receives a very fine example in this pandemic, which is obviously a state of permanent panic. So this permanence in panic is important, and that's something which I'm going to talk about a little bit. So panic not as a local category, panic not as a temporal category, panic not as a finite category, but panic as a permanent category, a permanent existential state, a permanent state to be, a permanent quality, a permanent epistemic quality, right? And also, we can talk about how there's a linguistic quality as well about this COVID-19, because even the language discourse, the language markers have changed, right? Because prior to COVID-19, if you remember, even then we had this medical metaphors about information. When we said that something went viral, for example, there's obviously a metaphor for information. A piece of information, a nugget of information is spreading like wildfire. There's an anarchic quality about it, which may not necessarily be negative. So something goes viral, it could perfectly be positive in quality in terms of how people are consuming it, and there's a degree of optimism about it. And if you want to make something sort of stick and spread, you make it viral. But of course, that metaphor has been, shall we say, re-metaphorized, right? So the idea of something going viral, obviously today has a very different kind of connotation in a COVID-19 state that we are in today. Now, also, if you just go back to the classical critical theory, and because I'm speaking as a critical theorist here, and the session over here is looking at COVID-19 through a critical studies perspective, a critical theory perspective, there's something very deconstructive about COVID-19 as well, not in a Derridian way, not in a purely Derridian way, but in a way which makes sort of post-structuralist understanding of panic, in the way that Malibu says, because Malibu obviously is a Derrida scholar, and Malibu looks at trauma, Malibu looks at panic, Malibu looks at the whole idea of infection through a post-structuralist lens. Now, if you just complicate the Derridian understanding of deconstruction here, it might offer a very interesting reading of this particular pandemic. So in a classic Derridian sense, the whole idea of signifier and signified is constantly differed and deferred. There's a temporal quality about the arrival of meaning. So meaning is never arrived at. It's permanently pushed away and it's permanently postponed. And this permanent postponement is something that I'm interested in. But also equally, it is always differing from the previous meaning. So the whole idea of differing away and deferring away, and hence the Derridian deference, which is a combination, a capsule of differing and deferring. But that at a very structural level, I'm not taking Derrida entirely and mapping him into this COVID-19 theme, because it's more complicated. Deconstruction is more complicated than deference, and all of us know that. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the structural quality of deconstruction in this defer paradigm, and I'm trying to locate that into our understanding of the pandemic, this particular COVID-19 pandemic. So in a sense that, the arrival of the ontological order, the knowledge about the virus, is constantly mutating, as we all know. The genetic mutations are happening very randomly, and hence the difficulty in finding a vaccine, because by the time you find a vaccine, the virus will have mutated itself. So there is this quality of differing all the time, right? So the genetic difference is happening all the time. It's sort of auto-differentiating itself. It's auto-mutating itself. And again, there's a degree of plasticity about it in a way the Malibu studies it. It's auto-plastic in quality. In a sense, it's producing its own ontological order very, very quickly. So there is no de-ontological order at all. So as a result of that, our address to this virus, our address to this panic is constantly being deferred away. Right? So in a very structural Derridian sense, we have this play, this entanglement, shall we say, between difference and deferral, right? And hence it is also in some existential experiential way and a medical experiential way, a very good classical structural example of Derridian difference, something that's always differing and deferring. And again, I'm interested in the temporal quality as well, perhaps more than a semiotic quality. We don't know what the virus quite is because it's mutating itself, but at the same time, it's not allowing a temporal address. There's no fixed time in which the virus and our knowledge of the virus can be situated together. right? So that temporal plane is unavailable to us, where we can situate ourselves, our knowledge system, and a virus together and address it. Because by the time we situate a knowledge system, the virus will have mutated into something else, right? So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said this is an example of a permanent deterritorialization. So our understanding of reality, our understanding of knowledge, our understanding of life systems is suffering a permanent prolepsis, shall we say, a permanent postponement instead of getting postponed over and over again. Now, what that does to obviously, this is the core thing that we talk about today, the knowledge system, and I believe that's one of the sub categories which are examined by this conference. So what is the post-COVID or the COVID knowledge system? So how is the human epistemic quality influenced or impacted or infected, shall we say, by COVID-19? So in other words, what we're looking at is the example of contagion in the knowledge system. Now, obviously, if we take a look at this particular webinar, this particular conference, it's a very classic distributed system of knowledge where everyone occupies a particular plane, where our physical knowledge of space-time, doesn't matter. It's blurred away. People in different parts of India, perhaps outside India as well, we're all inhabiting a particular virtual space-time, a virtual chronotop. In some sense, and obviously I'm drawing on Bakhtin's understanding of chronotop. It's a very key critical term, I think, especially in a way we can understand COVID-19 today. The whole idea of the virtual chronotop, a chronotop which is always changing, even as we inhabit it, right? So this fluidity of space-time, this plasticity of space-time is something which are all inhabiting today, and that's the way the knowledge system is operative. In the sense that we distribute knowledge, we disseminate knowledge, we consume knowledge through this very fluid system, which is completely virtual in quality. In other words, what this particular pandemic has done, and again, I'm going back to classic critical theory, it has generated an experiential fluidity, an existential fluidity in our understanding of reality. So reality has become a fluid phenomenon, and I use the word phenomenon quite phenomenologically, shall we say, not as a nominal phenomenon thing. It's a phenomenon because we can only experience it through affect. And this is the other point I'm going to come to in this particular session, the idea of affect. Because we can see that our understanding of reality has become a very affective understanding. And what do I mean by affective understanding? It depends on the way we consume knowledge. So for example, at a very purely statistical level, if we consume the information, which may be misinformation, that a locality in which we are situated is witnessing a sharp drop, a sharp decline in COVID cases. Now that obviously affects us in a happy way, and I'm talking about happiness as an affective category. So I'll mention Sarah Ahmed in a minute. But the happiness created out of statistics, the happiness created out of a consumption of statistics is obviously making us behave in a certain existential way. Now the very next day, if we see there's a sharp rise in the COVID cases in our locality, obviously that affects us in a very different way. In other words, our affective understanding of reality, interestingly, is informed by a consumption of statistics at this point of time. And I hope I'm making sense. Our understanding, our consumption of numbers, our consumption of statistics, our consumption of statistical reality, which is very mutable in quality. Again, it's like the genetic combination of the virus. It's very mutable. So the numbers are changing all the time, right? So, today it is something, it is X, tomorrow it can be X plus 15, next day it can be X minus 7, whatever. So there's a degree of genetic mutation like quality in the way we are consuming numbers of COVID cases. And obviously the consumption of statistics, the consumption of numbers, the consumption of this whole idea of reality around us, which is completely quantifiable, by the way, it's affecting our understanding of reality. So what we're looking at over here is an entanglement of quantifiability and affective understanding. Right? Now, what do I mean by that? Quantifiability and affective understanding. So the whole disease, the whole idea of the panic, we are making a desperate attempt to quantify it because we can't qualify it, mind you. And that's a very key distinction. We can't qualify the virus. We don't have a qualitative understanding of the virus yet, and hence we don't have a vaccine. So the best we can do is we can quantify the effect of the virus in a very crude way. So I'm beginning to become a bit mathematical, but obviously I'm connecting that to critical theory over here. So our quantitative understanding of the virus is something that we are using for effective understanding of reality. So when we see a particular quantity, a particular number ascribed to the virus, X in a locality today, X minus 15 or X plus 15, and that is obviously affecting our understanding of reality, which is purely based on our consumption of that particular number, our consumption of that particular quantity, right? So we actually looking at human life through a quantifiable quality, through a quantifiable prism in terms of numbers, in terms of statistics, right? And again, in a very Derridian sense, the numbers are differing all the time. The numbers are differing all the time because the numbers are always fluid in quality. They're always changing. We don't really see a freezing point. So again, if we take a look at the metaphors used in terms of COVID-19 cases, we're using the metaphor of flattening of curve. Very statistic, very statistical and very mathematical in quality. The flattening of the curve. Now, interestingly, that is perhaps our most coveted metaphor at this point of time. That is the metaphor we all aspire for. We all want the curve to be flattened off, right? So the flattening of the curve, this very mathematical quality, is something that has become existential at the moment. That's the most coveted existential category. That's the most coveted existential condition to be in, the condition where the curve is being flattened, right? So again, we're looking at a very diagrammatic understanding of reality, a very quantifiable understanding of reality, because anything else, apart from that, is unavailable to us. And as I mentioned, we do not have a qualitative understanding of the virus. We do not have a qualitative understanding of the reality. So all we can do is we can make these diagrams of reality, these caricatures of reality in terms of numbers, in terms of curves, in terms of graphs, and we ascribe our effect onto that. Now, this, in a very interesting sense, becomes what Sarah Ahmed talks about in terms of happy objects. Now, what are happy objects? And this is obviously something which can go back to affect theory. Again, a theoretical prism that I'm very interested in. The whole idea of affect theory. So we have this whole idea of affective objects. So objects which arouse certain affect of happiness, would be affect of nostalgia. So for example, we who are interested in memory studies will look at how certain markers of memory become important, how markers of affect become important. So in that sense, let's look at some of the markers of COVID-19, this particular pandemic that we're all inhabiting today. So what are some of the commonly consumed markers? The one obvious marker that we see on a very daily basis is the statistics, is the numbers, right? So I don't quite remember, I'm not sure if there was any other time in human history, at least in recent human history, where we're so attached to numbers. So effectively attached to numbers. Numbers going up and down, making us happy or sad. It's like a spectral shareholding share market, a very existential share market, which is spectral in quality, right? And I use the word spectral quite deliberately. I'm going to come back to the spectrality of it as well, right? So the whole idea of the human beings, the human COVID cases becoming this perverse spectral share market, which is going up and down. And obviously going up is a bad thing over here, going up is a dystopian thing, and going down a flattening of the curve is becoming a good thing, it's becoming a happy thing in some sense. So we have, in other words, an idea of an effective object, which is also a number, right? So we sort of, the entire politics of happiness at this particular point of time is very number-centric, it's very numer-centric in some sense, right? So, the whole attachment to numbers, the whole attachment to statistics is obviously creating or generating effect in some sense, right? And obviously this generational effect is also a consumptional effect. This generation and consumption happening simultaneously, right? In other words, we come back to the beginning of the session where we said that in the whole idea of the ontology of the pandemic. So what is the ontology of the pandemic? First of all, there is no ontology of the pandemic. There's no grand narrative of the pandemic. We don't know what the narrative is. And I use the word narrative in a very literary way because the whole idea of controlling the narrative, we don't know how to control this particular narrative. And hence we have media explosions. We have this very anarchic representations of COVID-19, this very, media narratives taking complete U-turns from day one to day two, because there's no way you can control the narrative. It's not linear in quality. It's cyclical in quality. It's going up and down. It's going out of the infection curve. It's coming back to the infection curve. So this whole loss, the whole Absence of narrative control is again a very important quality of this complex contagion. So this is the second term that I want you to take away from this particular session. The absence of narrative control. There's no narrative control over this pandemic. And by narrative, I use the word narrative like contagion as a very complex category. I use the word narrative in a medical sense. We sort of don't know the genetic narrative of the virus. So as a result of that, we don't know the vaccine narrative, which will address the virus. And that obviously, that lack of knowledge, that absence of knowledge is quickly becoming a cultural phenomenon. It's becoming an existential phenomenon. So we don't quite know how the infection works. We don't quite know how to get rid of the infection. So in other words, the whole narrative understanding of COVID-19 is unavailable to us. So the other term that I'm going to talk about, and obviously I'm throwing all these terms to you, a complex contagion, narrative confusion, or absence of narrative control. The other term that I would like to sort of offer in this particular session is the idea of the anarchic metaphor, right? So what do you mean by anarchic metaphor, COVID-19? Now, obviously, COVID-19 has become a metaphor. It's not really a matter anymore. It's becoming a metaphor, and it's already entered our collective imagination. It's already infected our collective imagination, our collective memory, in terms of how we understand it as a reality, as a biological reality, as a medical reality, as a cultural reality. Now, the reason why I'm using the word anarchic metaphor is because we don't quite know what it's a metaphor of. Obviously, it's a metaphor of a dystopian condition, etc. But the lack of knowledge about it, and in some sense, it's more of a metaphor and less of a matter. So in that sense, it complicates the entire metaphor relationship. Because in normal circumstances, we know something as matter first, and then we make it metaphorical in quality. Right, that's how we normally work in literary studies and cultural imagination and cultural narratives, etc. So, for example, this particular mark, we first know the mark is a Starbucks mark, and then we can make it into a metaphor into something else, capitalism, capitalist consumption, etc., etc., etc. But in the case of this particular pandemic, we don't quite know what the matter is. Right? We don't quite know the materiality of COVID-19, but we already have an understanding of the metaphoricity of COVID-19, what it can do in terms of a metaphor, what it can do in terms of destruction across the human imagination as a metaphor. Right? So COVID-19 has been condensed into a metaphor. It's a classic case of condensation. So the entire pandemic has been condensed into a metaphor, which is an anarchic metaphor, because its relationship to materiality is very, very contingent, right? So that's the reason why I use the word anarchic metaphor or mad metaphor, right? Because it's not a metaphor which is seamlessly emerged from a material. We don't quite know what the material is, but we have a metaphorical understanding of COVID-19 because we don't quite have a material understanding of COVID-19. And by material, I mean medical, I mean epistemic, I mean logical. We don't quite know logically what the virus really is and how it can infect us and how we can disinfect ourselves. But we have a metaphorical understanding of COVID-19. So that in a way complicates our relationship between matter and metaphor. So I'm just going to wind up now, and hopefully we'll have a few questions at the end. So just to go back to the beginning of this session. So when I title my talk as the ontology of the pandemic, what I'm actually trying to say is we don't have an ontology of the pandemic. So we have different micro categories in terms of our understanding of the pandemic. We don't quite know what the pandemic really is. We don't know how it spreads. It's a complex contagion, as I mentioned. So it's something which doesn't offer us narrative control. That's the second concept that I talked about in the session. It doesn't offer any narrative ownership. We can't own it through any particular narrative, whether it's a medical narrative or a literary narrative or a cultural narrative. And the best we can do is we can make it some kind of a metaphor. We can metaphorize it through understanding. So the only understanding of COVID-19 that we can have, ironically, are two kinds of understanding. One is a very hardcore statistical understanding, as I mentioned, is purely quantifiable. We can sort of locate it, we can navigate with it through quantity, through markers of numbers. And the other one is a very nebulous metaphorical understanding. So the middle ground of material understanding is unavailable to us in some sense. So COVID-19 today, if we are to look at it from a critical studies perspective, is a very fine example of a permanent panic, a permanent defamiliarization, a permanent deterritorialization. And obviously I use the word territorialization in a very spatial way. Our understanding of space and time has changed. For example, this particular webinar is a very good case in point. We have a very fluid sense of space, a very fluid sense of a spatial embodiment. So I am embodying myself through my voice and through my image in this particular session. And every one of us here, we are also having this proxy embodiments across different points of space and time. So the whole idea of deterritorialization is obviously a permanent condition at this particular point in time. And also, as I mentioned, at a very structural level, it has this deconstructive quality because, the whole idea, whole understanding, our semiotic understanding of COVID-19 is permanently differing away. In a very literal sense, the genetic understanding of COVID-19 is always differing away because of genetic mutations. As a result of that, our understanding of COVID-19 is also deferred. We haven't arrived at a time where we can actually know about COVID-19. So it's differing as well as differing. So it has an example of this at a structural level. There's a very direct difference which is happening in terms of our navigation with it, in terms of our existential navigation with it. And lastly, the whole idea of complex contagion, where we have different kinds of contagion which is intercorporeal in quality through bodies, but also interepistemic in quality, different knowledge systems, coming together, clashing together, and infecting each other in a way which is spreading very, very quickly. So I think, we have already seen a series of papers, series of academic articles, academic engagements with COVID-19, and obviously we can see how people are sort of devising the PhD plans, PhD ideas based on this particular pandemic, and the complexity of it obviously is we don't know what it really is. So we have different knowledge systems, different panic systems, different linguistic systems at odds with each other, at conflict with each other in this permanent deterritorialized frame, right? So this whole idea is very Heisenbergian quality of uncertainty that we're facing today through COVID-19. We don't know who's going to get infected. There's no privilege, there's no protection, there's no immunity using the markers of immunity which we have used before. Like, for example, when we have the knowledge that if someone is wealthy, if someone is protected in a social system, we have a less chance of infection. Now, obviously, that politics of protection is gone. That politics of privilege is gone. So what we're looking at is a sort of a raw metaphor, a naked metaphor, which doesn't quite have any material engagement, any material attachment yet. So this is my take on COVID-19 as a mad metaphor, as an anarchic metaphor, as a complex contagious category, and as a knowledge system which doesn't allow any narrative control. So I wind up with this, and I congratulate the organizers one more time for conceiving this conference, and I'm thanking them for inviting me to this particular session, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for generously sharing your time and expertise. Now, I would like to request our participants, if they have any questions, you can go ahead and clarify your doubts. The participants.
Dr. Borah?
Yes, Manali, ma'am.
Yeah. May I take this opportunity to clarify one doubt of mine?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your lecture. I was just wondering, can we associate Nicholas Rose's notion of molecularization of life with this pandemic era, where Rose says that we need to revise Foucault's notion of biopolitics in order to understand the current time? So is there a relationship between Nicholas Rose's notion of molecularization of life, when he wants to revise this entire concept of biopolitics?
Yeah, I would agree, because see, the whole idea of molecularization is also a form of digitization. You're giving numbers, you're digitizing the human self, you're digitizing the human condition. And that's what we are doing at the moment. We are digitizing ourselves. So every person is potentially a COVID positive case, right? So we are looking, and again, this is certainly, there's also a certain degree of physics-like quality about us. So whether we're charged or not charged. So if you're infected, we're positive. If you're not infected, we're not positive. So all of us are still waiting to be positive in certain sense, right? And this anticipation of positivity, which is obviously a very perverse form of positivity, is also, in a way, a kind of digitization. So the moment you become a positive case, you just become that. You become a COVID positive person. And that becomes the only identity available to you. So that is a very classic biopolitical thing, as you correctly mentioned. The whole idea of digitizing the human, giving the human a particular, sort of symptomizing the human, and in the process reifying the person biologically and medically. So Rose talks about reification from a medical perspective, and I think that's exactly what's happening now, because all of us are sort of anticipating this positivity. All of us are waiting, in some sense, helplessly to get infected and to be positivized. So the whole idea of COVID positive and COVID negative is very akin, structurally speaking, to what you just mentioned about Rose's understanding of molecularization. So I would agree, yes.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Manali, I think Rimi Nandi, she has a question for sir.
Okay.
Rimi Nandi, you can unmute yourself, Rimi.
Good morning, sir.
Good
Thank
morning.
you for such a wonderful session. Um, I I have two questions actually. First is how are the narratives of the preceding pandemics different from the present one?
Hmm.
You did mention there is no grand narrative. Still, we as human beings we always try to narrativize um, any disease. So, how is the present pandemic different, the narrative of the pandemic different from the previous one? And the second question I have is with respect to the term viral. So the term viral with reference to the social network.
Hmm.
So how can we connect the term viral with pandemic and that of the social network?
Yes, very good question. Thank you. So the whole idea
Thank
of
you, sir.
storytelling is obviously a very human activity, and you're quite right. There is no grand narrative because we don't quite know what story to say apart from our experience of the pandemic, right? Which is a very micro experience. And I was recently, if I could just mention, I was recently in a panel where people are talking about the literature that might emerge from this particular pandemic, and someone was saying that people are writing stories already, right? And as a result, we don't really have any novels coming out. We have very short microfiction, flash fiction, which may not be edited well, which may not be qualitatively very good, etc., etc. Now, my response to that was very commonsensical, because at a very real level, we don't know if you will survive this pandemic. So forget about editing later, forget about processing later. The only way we can produce stories is through this knee-jerk narratives, right? I hope I'm making sense. This very knee-jerk, immediate narratives based on immediate experiences. So in that sense, flash fiction is quite possibly the best genre at the moment, because of its episodic quality. It's just one episode. We see something happening to us or someone else. It's just one moment of infection, one moment of contagion, and that's all we know. We don't know how the contagion spreads. We don't have a before and an after. It's just the moment of immediacy, the moment of infection. It's not really the moment of epiphany, it's the moment of infection where the person is getting infected. And that's the only story we can tell, how we are protecting ourselves from infection and how we're witnessing that infection. So in that sense, I think it differs a lot from in a previous understanding of disease that we've had through storytelling. And also because at a very real level, we have more tools of storytelling today compared to, I mean, let's say when the Spanish flu occurred in 1918, or even before that, any example of any collective disease, we didn't really have so many motor mechanisms of storytelling. But today we have this very distributive quality of storytelling, where all you need to do is post a photo on Instagram and write a couple of lines, and that becomes a story. Now, I do not necessarily see that as a bad narrative. I have problems with the assumption that just because something is short, just because something is not edited, it's not really a good literature. Because, like you mentioned, I mean, there may not be any literature at all. I mean, the human race might be wiped off if this pandemic sort of goes on in the way it is. So, at a very real level, storytelling as an act of self-preservation, you preserve yourself, you preserve your panic, you preserve your trauma by giving it a narrative. That becomes perhaps, as you very correctly pointed out, that perhaps becomes the only resistance we have at this point in time with the absence of any medical help, absence of any medical knowledge about it. All we can do is tell our stories at a very micro level, at a very sort of neural, knee-jerk, immediate level. So I hope I answered the first bit of a question. Can you just repeat the second bit? I do remember it, but can you just highlight it one more time? The second,
Um,
yeah,
the second question was with respect to the term viral,
virus. Yes, yes,
mm,
yes.
with
So I think
reference to the pandemic and the social network.
yeah, it's a very good example of sort of metaphorization and remetaphorization. Because prior to the pandemic, the word viral, as I mentioned before, was a metaphor of something spreading quickly, which is not necessarily negative. So if you want something to spread quickly, if you want something to stick quickly, you make it viral. And obviously, there are mechanisms, the material mechanisms through which we can make it. There are IT cells. If you're a political party, there are the social networks that you can spread. So the whole mechanism of spreading something or making something contagious in quality was that the metaphor used was viral. Now, obviously, with this particular pandemic, it's like a metaphor coming back with a vendetta in some sense. So obviously we need to be more careful about the use of the word viral because it's not really an innocent metaphor anymore. It never was an innocent metaphor in the first place. When you make something viral, you have an agenda behind it. It's going to be political agenda, ideological agenda, whatever. But obviously the word viral now has a very different kind of connotation and be very interesting if we survive this pandemic. Fingers crossed, if we survive this pandemic, whether we'll go back to the word viral in the same sense as we did before. I'd be very interested to see that. If it will retain its earlier metaphorical code, whether it will remain a metaphor, whether it will be a dead metaphor, it's also perfectly possible. We all know what a dead metaphor is. If we use something excessively and if it just becomes just a metaphor, the materiality goes away. For example, with the case of pandemic, we don't know the materiality of it. We don't know the materiality of COVID-19. It is just a metaphor. And if it becomes just a metaphor, and if you use the word viral to define it, it will exhaust itself. The metaphor will exhaust itself out in some sense. And the exhaustion of the metaphor can make it a dead metaphor. And there are examples of dead metaphors that we can all think of. So my hunch is, in a post-pandemic case, the word viral will be a dead metaphor. But we'll have to see and wait out in terms of witnessing how that happens. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Krupa Shah, she has a question. Krupa, are you online?
Yes, yes, I am.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Parui. I really enjoyed listening to your talk, and I found it especially interesting to see how you have connected such a variety of different concepts and categories to map the ontology or the lack of it of the pandemic. I had two questions. The first one is about one of the characteristics of the pandemic that you mentioned, which is that it has leveled differences and it has also reterritorialized privilege. I was wondering if it would be possible to argue just the opposite, in fact, that the pandemic has sort of magnified, you know, a lot of social inequalities, especially when it comes to gender relations, in a domestic environment. And it has also brought about or brought to light a lot of social stereotypes when it comes to hygiene and a particular class, for example.
Yeah.
And of course, the issues of the migrant workers. When it comes to privilege, I think there's definitely a sort of disparity when it comes to these movements and migrations. And I was wondering what you would have to say about that. And the second question was about what you said of the pandemic being an anarchic metaphor. I was wondering if it's possible to look at it also as a metaphor that produces other metaphors.
Mm.
It may not draw from a particular matter,
Yeah.
but it certainly has been an environment to drive metaphors like hyper-nationalism or any
Mm.
sort of related imaginary. So if you had something to say about that as well.
Yeah, excellent. I'll take the second one first. It's brilliant. I mean, it's exactly what I mentioned, had in mind. Perhaps I should have spelled it out. I mean, because it's such a loose metaphor. It's such a fluid metaphor, and in a very and obviously, if you go back to Deleuze, it's like a nodal point where different metaphors can come together and take up different associations, and they can spread like a virus. So there's a viral quality in the whole politics of metaphorization. And as you very correctly pointed out, it's a really brilliant observation. I should thank you for that. The whole idea of, because it doesn't really have any material attachment as such, right? There's no fixed materiality that it can attach itself to. So it can just take
Right.
up different kinds of metaphors in a very viral way. And as you mentioned, hypernationalism, as you mentioned, racism, that's obviously a very, very key metaphor waiting to happen. Very soon we might have papers which might sort of empirically prove how black people and non-white people are more prone to COVID-19 because of the hygienic habits. And this obviously connects
Right.
you be a question on privilege. So it is actually is perfectly possible, and I'm completely with you on that. In terms of how this one metaphor can have this nodal quality, how it can be this
Yes.
nodal metaphor, but different metaphors can come together centrifugally as well as centripetally. So it can come together in a very centripetal way, but also it can generate different kinds of metaphoric associations in a centrifugal way, from going from the center and also coming towards the center. So I'm completely, I'm absolutely inclined to agree with you on that, and that's something I'll think about later. Thanks to your very, very brilliant observation. As for the first question, yes, absolutely. It has highlighted many social disparities which we already knew existed, but suddenly it become visible. And I think the key term over here is visibility. Right? We always
Right.
knew that there are people who are essentially slaves. They are ill-paid. They live in miserable conditions, and we chose not to see it because they're not visible. And the whole idea of visible life and invisible life, something which Bauman talks about, wasted lives in a metropolis, is in every city will have this invisible demography, which are very crucial for the functioning of the city, but it also must remain invisible. It's like a classic Roman ship, which is rowed by the slaves, but the slaves occupy the lowest deck. You must not see the slaves. The ship must not, make the slaves visible in some sense, because the grandeur of the Roman ship will then disappear if the slaves become visible. Right, so the very ontology of slavery, in some sense, was reliant on invisibility. Make that invisible just so it doesn't exist, so the grandeur becomes foregrounded in some sense. Now, what this particular pandemic has done, as you very correctly pointed out, it has sort of magnified certain disparities, certain social inequalities, which are always there. Now, my point wasn't that. Obviously, I'm completely in agreement with you in terms of how the social disparities have now become more visible, and we have this the whole idea of visible life and invisible life, that borderline has blurred away in some sense, because suddenly
Okay.
the most spectacular demography is a migrant worker. They are the spectacles now. They occupy the spectacle now because of the miserable conditions. We are forced to see them. We can't take our eyes off. We can't wash our hands off and say we're not responsible for that. We know now that we have always been responsible for the miserable condition, right? And that also creates a sense of guilt, a sense of collective
Right.
empathy, a sense of tragedy. Now, my point was that the very core idea of infection, the way the virus spreads, the way the virus is infecting people. Now, in some perverse sense, the infection logic, if we can use the word logic away, because there's no logic actually, the infection logic of the virus, it doesn't follow, it doesn't respect any politics of privilege that we normally associate with. Like, for example, if you're a very strong politician, you won't get infected because you have bodyguards around you who are protecting you all the time. If you're a very famous celebrity, you won't get infected because you live in this mansion away from the riffraff, away from the migrant workers, so you don't get infected. But the point is, the infection mechanism of this particular virus, it cuts across that privilege. So at a level of infection, I think it does away with privilege, but at a level of social inequality, I think what this pandemic has shown, as you very correctly pointed out, it has magnified the structural inequalities
Right.
which are always there. And I am interested in the idea of visibility over it. It's made things visible. So suddenly, the only
Okay.
space which is the public space is the domestic space, because our access to public space is interrupted. We can't go out anymore. So the whole idea of private space, public space is blurred away in some sense. So the mechanism of public space is also entered the private space. We have examples of domestic violence, we have examples of violence done on women, which is obviously shot up when the pandemic has happened. So that has become the only space which is visible now. Now, obviously, that's always taken place. Domestic violence has
Yes.
always been there. But what this pandemic has done, again, like the migrant population, like the migrant tragedy, like the miserable conditions that people have suffered, the domestic violence spectacle of that particular space has also become a spectacle. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, and I'm agreeing with you entirely, is that these invisible networks of inequality, these invisible networks of injustice, has suddenly become hyper visible in quality with the arrival of the pandemic. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any more questions? Participants, do you have any more questions for sir? Manali, ma'am,
Yes.
I think that's all. I have no more questions. I don't see any questions in the chat box as well.
So, okay, so we may request the participants to break and rejoin us by 10:45 for the paper presentations.
Thank you very much.
So,
Thank you
sir,
so much,
we're
sir.
extremely, yeah, we're extremely grateful to you for connecting with us for this session and delivering the talk for the conference, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, I have been to VIT Chennai many times. I have very fond memories of the institute, and I look forward to going there in person in the not too distant future in happy and healthy times. And I wish everyone attending the session a very safe and healthy stay during this pandemic. And I hope that we find an ontology very soon for the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks
you
a
so
lot,
much.
sir. Thank you, sir. So, Dr. Rashmi, I have already posted the two links for the session. Could you please kindly give the instruction to the participants?
Yes, yeah, the participants, they can break for, say, 10 minutes, Manali ma'am. We can join at sharp 10:40
Yes,
for
we will
the
join
session.
sharp at 10:40. So I'm just
10:40.
reading the name of the presenters who will be presenting for session 1 and session 2.
Session
So
2.
yeah, for session 1, the session chair is Dr. Namrata Sharma. So she will be listening to papers
Namrata Pathak.
presented.
Manali
Sorry.
ma'am, Namrata Pathak. Namrata
Sorry.
Pathak.
Yeah, Namrata Pathak. I'm extremely sorry. So the session chair is Dr. Namrata Pathak. So she will be listening to papers presented by Dr. Lata Mishra, Dr. Payal Pal, and Dr. Pragya Singh. So these are the three papers that will be presented in the session 1. The link is provided to you on the chat box. And the session 2 will be chaired by Dr. Deepak Kumar. So he will be listening to three papers. One is on is a joint paper. So the paper title I'll be reading out: Abilities of Online Teaching and Learning. And the second paper will be presented by Dr. Raju Maji. And the third paper is by Mayurakshi Basu. So we request all the presenters to kindly be ready, and we will rejoin at sharp
At
at
sharp 10:40.
10:40, and kindly use the links to join the session that you'd like to join to the participants in general. So can we just stop for
Yeah,
a while,
we
Dr.
can
Borah?
break. Yeah, we can take a break for 10 minutes and we can come back.
Okay.
Thank you, participants.
Dr. Borah, could you please write the information on the chat box, because a few of the participants have joined, so they might have missed the information.
Okay, okay. Let me write it down, Dr. Manali, so
Yeah.
that
So participants who are not presenting today, they may choose to join any of the sessions.
so participants can join session 1 and session 2. Links are given in the chat box. And we can take a break for, say, another 10 minutes. Yeah, we can come back sharp 10:40, participants. And the links have been, you can see the links in the chat box. Dr. Manali Karmakar has posted the
Yes, yes,
links,
yeah.
session 1 and session 2. Yeah, so participants, I request all of you to take a break. You can go for break, you can come back, and we'll meet, say, after 10 minutes, 10:40 sharp. Thank you. So Manali ma'am, can we stop here for a while and we can come back again?